The Craftsman's Burden. The morning mist clung to the Sparkbrook workshop like a shroud, and in the pale light filtering through grimy windows, James Paris Lee bent over his workbench, calloused fingers tracing the contours of a rifle that would reshape an empire's destiny. The Lee-Enfield lay before him, its bolt-action mechanism gleaming with the precision of a master craftsman's obsession. He was 63 years old. His back bent from decades hunched over machinery, yet his hands moved with the certainty of a man who understood that wars were won not by generals, but by the anonymous artisans who forged the tools of survival. The year was 1895, and the British Empire stretched across continents it could barely defend. Reports from the colonies painted a grim picture. Soldiers armed with single-shot Martini Henry rifles facing Boer commandos with German Mausers, their superior rate of fire turning British formations into graveyards. In the War Office, red-faced colonels blamed tactics, weather, even the character of modern youth, anything except the truth that James Paris Lee had been trying to tell them for 15 years. The Empire's backbone was breaking because its soldiers carried weapons designed for a war that no longer existed. The workshop smelled of machine oil and metal shavings, scents that had become as familiar to Lee as his own breathing. Outside, Birmingham's industrial heart pounded with the rhythm of progress, but inside these walls, time seemed suspended between past failures and uncertain futures. The rifle before him represented more than mechanical innovation. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent wrestling with the mathematics of survival. Lee's weathered hands paused over the bolt mechanism, remembering another morning 16 years earlier when the first design had crystallized in his mind. The breakthrough had been elegant in its simplicity, a straight pull bolt action that allowed a trained soldier to fire 20 aimed rounds per minute, 4 times faster than existing rifles. Yet that revelation had brought its own burden, the knowledge that efficiency in war meant efficiency in ending lives. A soft knock interrupted his reverie. Thomas Mitchell, the young engineer from the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, stood in the doorway holding a telegram. His face bore the expression of a man carrying news too significant for casual delivery. "Mr. Lee, this just arrived from the War Office. The field trials in South Africa. They want to see you immediately." Lee accepted the telegram with steady hands, though his heart quickened. The partnership between his theoretical brilliance and British manufacturing expertise had created a weapon that balanced lethality with reliability. The .303 caliber Lee-Enfield featured a 10-round magazine, rapid bolt operation, and most crucially, the ability to function in mud, sand, ice, and the 1,000 environmental catastrophes that destroyed lesser weapons. But perfection in engineering bred new anxieties in the conscience. "Have they decided then?" Lee asked, his Scottish accent still thick after decades in England. "The reports from the colonies speak for themselves. British soldiers equipped with your rifles maintained sustained fire that broke cavalry charges and suppressed enemy positions. The tide of colonial conflicts has shifted decisively." Lee nodded slowly, but his most frequent thought remained unspoken. If each rifle could fire 20 rounds per minute, and Britain planned to manufacture 100,000 rifles annually, how many young men would die because of his ingenuity? He had created the weapon to end wars quickly, but quick wars still demanded their tribute in blood and grief. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. Lee's fingers found the familiar texture of the rifle's stock, worn smooth by countless hours of adjustment and refinement. Each scratch and mark told the story of a man who understood that true strength emerged not from violence, but from the precision and dedication of minds that refused to accept failure as final. Yet, as he prepared to leave for London, Lee could not shake the feeling that his greatest creation might also become his heaviest burden. Wars devoured young men, and though his invention promised to devour them more efficiently, The devouring continued nonetheless. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How does a man measure the weight of weapons when they're carried by hands he'll never shake? The train to London carried Lee through the industrial heartland of England, where factory smokestacks reached toward grey November skies like mechanical prayers. In his compartment, he spread the colonial reports across his lap, each page documenting the mathematical precision of modern warfare. British formations at Mafeking had delivered 15 aimed rounds per minute, the mad minute, creating such rapid, accurate fire that enemy forces believed they faced machine gun battalions rather than infantry companies. Lee had been born in Scotland to a family that understood hardship as intimately as breathing. His father, a failed inventor whose dreams died in patent offices, had taught young James a bitter lesson. The world doesn't want better, son. It wants familiar. When the family emigrated to America, Lee carried that wound like shrapnel in his chest. He worked in textile mills, studied engineering by candlelight, and slowly, methodically, began to understand the mathematics of mechanical precision. But it was the sight of Civil War veterans, men missing limbs and eyes, that crystallized his purpose. Wars devoured young men, and the devouring could only be stopped by weapons that ended conflicts quickly, decisively. At least, that had been the theory. Now, reading casualty figures from the Boer War, Lee wondered if his life's work had simply made killing more efficient rather than more decisive. The train's rhythm matched his troubled thoughts as Birmingham's factories gave way to English countryside. Through the window, he glimpsed farmers harvesting the last crops before winter, their work untouched by the mechanical precision that had consumed his adult life. Their simplicity seemed enviable, growing food rather than engineering tools of destruction. His first rifle design had come to him in 1879, born from sleepless nights spent calculating angles and spring tensions. When he demonstrated the prototype to American military officials, they nodded politely and filed his plans in bureaucratic oblivion. Too complicated for field conditions, they declared. Soldiers need simplicity, not sophistication. The rejection should have destroyed him. But Lee possessed the particular stubbornness of men who've been underestimated their entire lives. He mortgaged his small machine shop, sold his wife's jewelry, and continued refining his design. Years passed in a blur of modified springs, adjusted firing pins, and endless test firings that left his ears ringing and his savings depleted. Neighbors whispered about the strange Scotsman who talked to machines and emerged from his workshop covered in oil stains and unrealistic dreams. Then had come the telegram from Britain, the invitation that would transform his mechanical obsession into imperial necessity. The Lee Metford rifle, incorporating his bolt mechanism, had proven itself in colonial skirmishes, but military engineers wanted improvements. Could Mr. Lee collaborate with the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield? Could he transform his mechanism into something that could equip a 1,000,000-man army? London's sooty skyline appeared on the horizon as the train approached Paddington Station. Lee folded the reports carefully, noting how the official language, superior firepower, tactical advantage, decisive engagement, never mentioned the faces of men who carried his rifles into those decisive moments. The mathematical precision of war had a way of reducing human complexity to statistical probability. At the War Office, brass-buttoned officers would praise his innovation and discuss production quotas. They would speak of empire and duty, of technological superiority and national security. But Lee knew that somewhere in the South African veldt, young soldiers were learning to operate bolt mechanisms with their lives, depending on the smooth function of springs and firing pins designed in a Birmingham workshop. The partnership between Lee and Enfield had been like watching poetry emerge from bureaucracy, his theoretical brilliance merged with British manufacturing expertise. Yet as the train pulled into the station, Lee understood that this London meeting would mark not the culmination of his work, but the beginning of a new and more complex burden. The Empire's backbone would no longer break because its soldiers carried weapons designed for a war that no longer existed. Now it would be strengthened by weapons designed for wars that had not yet been imagined. What happens when an inventor's greatest success becomes his deepest doubt? The War Office occupied a massive Georgian building that seemed to exhale the weight of imperial responsibility with every breath. In Colonel Hartwell's oak-panelled office, maps of the Empire covered entire walls, red patches marking territories defended by men carrying rifles born from Lee's restless mind. The colonel, a veteran of Afghan campaigns, studied Lee with the measured gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating tools and their makers. "Mr. Lee, your weapon has proven itself admirably. The reports from South Africa speak of Boer commandos retreating rather than engaging our forces. Superior firepower has strategic implications beyond individual battles." Lee accepted the praise with a nod, but his thoughts drifted to letters he had received from soldiers' families. Grateful mothers wrote of sons who credited their survival to rapid reloading capabilities. Grateful commanders described victories won by sustained fire rather than superior courage. Yet these same letters carried undertones that troubled his craftsman's conscience. "Colonel, if I may ask, have you considered the broader implications of such rapid-fire capability? Each improvement in efficiency means fewer British casualties and faster resolution of conflicts." "Your mechanical innovation serves the cause of peace, Mr. Lee. Wars end more quickly when one side possesses overwhelming advantage." Outside the colonel's window, London bustled with the confidence of an empire at its zenith. Horse-drawn carriages shared cobblestone streets with the occasional motor car, while vendors called their wares in accents from a dozen British territories. The city embodied the complexity Lee had tried to serve, a civilization built on trade, industry, and the military capability to protect both. But perfectionism bred new anxieties. As the first production models rolled off Enfield assembly lines, Lee found himself haunted by mathematics of a different kind. If each rifle could fire 20 rounds per minute, and Britain planned to manufacture 100,000 rifles annually, the arithmetic of warfare had shifted fundamentally. The mad minute, 15 aimed rounds in 60 seconds, had become the standard that separated professional soldiers from mere riflemen. Colonel Hartwell spread detailed schematics across his desk, pointing to modifications requested by field commanders. Extended magazines, improved sights, mechanisms adapted for desert conditions, each enhancement represented lessons learned in actual combat. The rifle was evolving beyond its creator's original vision, becoming something larger and more complex than a single man's engineering dream. The next phase involves scaling production. We need rifles that can equip not just colonial forces, but potential European engagements. The balance of power is shifting, Mr. Lee. Nations that possess superior small arms will shape the coming century. Lee traced the mechanical drawings with calloused fingers, seeing beyond blueprints to the workshops where men would manufacture these weapons by the thousand. Each rifle required precision machining, careful assembly, and testing that ensured reliability under conditions he could barely imagine. The partnership between his theoretical innovation and industrial capability was creating something unprecedented in military history. A soft knock interrupted their discussion. A young aide entered carrying a leather pouch marked with military seals, field reports from units newly equipped with Lee-Enfield rifles. The colonel read silently, his expression growing increasingly satisfied. Exceptional accuracy at extended range. Minimal mechanical failure, even in adverse conditions. Rate of fire that disrupts enemy tactical planning. Mr. Lee, your creation has exceeded every expectation. Yet Lee read those same reports differently, counting casualties and wondering if his workshop creation had simply made conflict more deadly rather than more decisive. The rifle's true test would come during larger engagements, where Lee-Enfield rifles in trained hands could create sustained fire that changed the fundamental nature of warfare itself. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the War Office, Lee understood that his mechanical obsession had become something beyond personal achievement. The weapon bearing his name would carry that burden into conflicts he could not foresee, operated by men whose faces he would never know. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When does an inventor stop owning his creation and start being owned by it? Winter settled over Birmingham with the weight of industrial smoke and unspoken doubts. In his workshop, now expanded to accommodate government contracts, Lee supervised the production of rifle components with meticulous attention to detail. Each bolt mechanism required 23 separate machining operations, and he personally inspected every 10th rifle that left his facility. The precision demanded by military specifications had transformed his intimate craft into something resembling industrial symphony. Young apprentices worked alongside master craftsmen, learning to measure tolerances in thousandths of inches. The workshop that had once housed a single obsessed inventor now employed 47 men, each responsible for specific aspects of the manufacturing process. Steam-powered machinery hummed through 14-hour shifts, producing components that would travel to Enfield for final assembly. Thomas Mitchell arrived most mornings with reports from the Royal Small Arms Factory, where production had reached 8,000 rifles monthly. The numbers satisfied military procurement officers, but Lee found himself studying the faces of workers rather than manufacturing statistics. Each man understood he was creating instruments of war, yet none could predict where those instruments might ultimately be employed. "Mr. Lee, we've received a request from the Admiralty. They want rifles adapted for naval use, shorter stocks, corrosion-resistant mechanisms. The world is paying attention to British military innovation." Lee nodded, but his attention drifted to a letter on his workbench. It came from Lieutenant William Hayes of the Northumberland Fusiliers, stationed in India's northwest frontier. Hayes wrote with the careful penmanship of an educated soldier, describing how Lee-Enfield rifles had performed during a recent skirmish with tribal raiders. The rapid-fire capability proved decisive in breaking their initial charge, Hayes reported. However, I must confess concern about the psychological effect on our own men. Such efficient weapons change how soldiers think about combat itself. Some express satisfaction at our technological advantage, while others seem troubled by the ease with which modern warfare can be conducted. This observation resonated with Lee's own evolving thoughts. During testing, he would arrive at dawn and work until midnight, his aged hands guided by an almost mystical understanding of metal and mechanism. But mechanical perfection could not address the human complexity of warfare. His rifles functioned flawlessly in mud, sand, ice, and the 1,000 environmental catastrophes that destroyed lesser weapons. Yet they could not resolve the moral catastrophes that accompanied their use. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who operated a clinic for military families in Birmingham, visited Lee's workshop that December afternoon. She had treated soldiers returning from colonial service, men whose physical wounds healed faster than their psychological adjustments. Her presence reminded Lee that weapons affected not only those who faced them, but those who carried them. "James, you've created something remarkable from an engineering perspective. But have you considered the burden placed on men who must operate these weapons? Efficiency in war creates its own moral complexity. Lee guided her through the workshop, explaining manufacturing processes while pondering her question. Workers assembled bolt mechanisms with practiced skill, unaware they were participating in conversations about the ethics of military technology. The disconnect between creation and consequence had become increasingly troubling to Lee's methodical mind. "I designed these rifles to end conflicts quickly, Elizabeth. If wars conclude faster, surely fewer lives are lost overall. Perhaps. Or perhaps more efficient weapons simply enable conflicts that might otherwise remain minor skirmishes. Technological capability has a way of expanding to meet available application." Her words echoed his father's bitter lesson about innovation and acceptance. The world might want better weapons, but it also wanted familiar justifications for their use. Lee's mechanical genius had provided both superior capability and comfortable rationalization for those who deployed that capability. As evening approached, Lee stood alone in his workshop, surrounded by machines that could produce instruments of war with unprecedented precision. Through grimy windows, Birmingham's industrial landscape glowed with furnace light and ambition. Somewhere in that complex machinery of progress, individual conscience wrestled with collective purpose. The rifle's true test would come during larger engagements, where Lee-Enfield weapons would define new standards of military effectiveness. But Lee was beginning to understand that the most difficult test might be the one he faced each morning in his workshop mirror. How long can a man carry two conflicting truths without breaking? The telegram arrived on a fog-shrouded morning in March 1916, 21 years after Lee had first bent over his workbench in Sparkbrook. By then he was 84 and nearly blind, but he could still identify a Lee-Enfield by the distinctive click of its bolt action. The message came from General Sir Douglas Haig, commander of British forces in France, and it contained information that would recontextualize everything Lee thought he understood about his life's work. "The rifle created by your genius has performed beyond all expectations during the Battle of Mons," the telegram read. "German forces, when interrogated, report they believed they faced machine gun battalions rather than infantry companies. The sustained fire capability of Lee-Enfield rifles in trained hands has fundamentally altered tactical doctrine. However, I write with additional intelligence that may interest you personally." Lee's grandson, Robert, read the remainder aloud in the small parlor where Lee now spent his days. The Great War had transformed his mechanical innovation into something unrecognizable. Millions of rifles bearing his name, carried by men whose names he would never learn, into trenches that redefined the meaning of industrial warfare. Captured German documents revealed that enemy commanders specifically identify British rapid-fire capability as their greatest tactical challenge. Your workshop creation has become the Empire's backbone, carried by soldiers who never learned the name of the craftsman who gave them the tools to survive. More significantly, interrogated prisoners consistently report that British fire discipline, their ability to maintain 20 aimed rounds per minute, breaks German unit cohesion more effectively than artillery bombardment. The central secret that had haunted Lee for decades was finally articulated. His rifles had indeed ended wars quickly, but not in the way he had imagined. Instead of brief, decisive conflicts, they had enabled prolonged, mechanized warfare, where efficiency in killing became the determining factor in national survival. The mad minute had evolved into something far removed from his workshop calculations. Robert continued reading, his young voice struggling with the weight of revelation. Field reports indicate that German forces, equipped with their own rapid-fire weapons, engage British units in sustained firefights that can last hours rather than minutes. Both sides possess efficient rifles, creating stalemates resolved only by massive industrial production. Your innovation, adopted by all major powers, has transformed warfare from tactical skill to manufacturing capacity. Lee's weathered hands trembled slightly as he absorbed this information. Letters from grateful soldiers, grateful mothers, grateful commanders filled boxes in his modest home. Testimonials to weapons that had kept British soldiers alive in circumstances beyond anything he had envisioned. Yet his most frequent comment, when visitors mentioned the war's progress, remained wondering aloud about the men who hadn't come home despite carrying his rifles. Dr. Morrison, now greying herself, visited that afternoon with additional context from her work with military hospitals. She had treated soldiers from Ypres, Somme, and Passchendaele, men whose survival often depended on the mechanical reliability of rifles designed in Birmingham decades earlier. James, your weapons function exactly as designed. The problem isn't mechanical failure, it's moral success. Both sides can now sustain deadly accurate fire for hours. Battles that might have lasted minutes now continue for days. The realization struck Lee with devastating clarity. The weapon had fulfilled its promise of decisive superiority, but war itself had evolved, becoming more terrible rather than more brief. His quest to prevent the devouring of young men had instead industrialized the process, making it more efficient and therefore more sustainable. As evening approached, Lee sat surrounded by letters that told a story he had never intended to write. His mathematical precision had created mechanical perfection, but mechanical perfection in the service of warfare had generated consequences that extended far beyond workshop calculations. The precision and dedication of his mind, refusing to accept failure as final, had succeeded too completely. What happens when our greatest achievement becomes something we never intended to create? The armistice of November 11, 1918, found James Paris Lee in his parlour, surrounded by letters from a war that had finally ended. By then, he was 86 and nearly blind, but visitors to his modest home discovered something unexpected. Rather than celebrating the victory his rifles had helped secure, Lee spent his final years wrestling with the mathematics of unintended consequences. Robert read him daily reports from the Western Front's aftermath, casualty figures that staggers the imagination. Millions of young men whose lives had ended in mechanized warfare, where efficient weapons enabled prolonged killing rather than swift resolution. The Lee-Enfield rifles, produced by the hundreds of thousands, had functioned flawlessly in mud, sand, ice, and the thousand environmental catastrophes of trench warfare. They had performed exactly as designed. Grandfather General Haig has written again. He wants to recommend you for national honors, recognition of your contribution to victory. Lee waved away such considerations with a trembling hand. Honor seemed irrelevant when weighed against the knowledge that his workshop creation had become instrumental in the most destructive conflict in human history. The partnership between his theoretical brilliance and British manufacturing expertise had produced not just superior weapons, but a template for industrial warfare that would reshape military thinking for generations. Dr. Morrison's final visit came in December, when Birmingham's industrial sky carried the first hint of snow. She brought news from military hospitals, where soldiers were learning to live with what physicians called war neurosis, psychological effects of combat that extended far beyond physical injury. Many specifically mentioned the sustained firefights enabled by rapid-fire weapons, engagements that could continue for hours without decisive resolution. James, you must understand. Your rifles saved countless British lives. Soldiers' right of survival that depended entirely on their weapons' reliability, but they also right of warfare that exceeded human comprehension, where mechanical efficiency created new forms of suffering. Lee nodded slowly, his fingers finding the familiar texture of a letter from Lieutenant Hayes. The young officer had survived the war, but wrote with the measured tone of a man forever changed by experiences his vocabulary could not adequately describe. The precision of our weapons matched the precision of the enemy's weapons, Hayes reported. Neither side could gain decisive advantage through superior firepower alone. Victory required industrial capacity to sustain production of ammunition and replacement rifles longer than the enemy could manage. This had become the central paradox of Lee's legacy. His innovation, designed to prevent prolonged conflicts, had instead enabled the most prolonged and destructive war in history. Both sides possessed efficient rifles, creating the stalemates that could only be resolved through massive industrial production and national exhaustion rather than tactical superiority. As winter deepened, Lee often sat in his workshop, now silent except for the whisper of wind through broken windows. The machinery that had once produced rifle components stood covered in dust, monuments to an ambition that had succeeded beyond its creator's imagination or desire. The distinctive click of a Lee-Enfield bolt action still echoed in his memory, but now that sound carried weight that extended far beyond mechanical precision. Thomas Mitchell, himself now aged by decades of military production, made regular visits to check on the old inventor. He found Lee increasingly contemplative, studying letters from soldiers who credited their survival to weapons manufactured in Birmingham, while simultaneously questioning whether that survival had been purchased at too high a collective cost. "Mr. Lee, you shouldn't burden yourself with guilt about outcomes you never intended. Your rifles functioned as designed. They gave British soldiers decisive advantages in individual engagements. Perhaps that's the problem, Thomas. They worked too well. Both sides acquired similar capabilities, and warfare became a matter of which nation could manufacture precision instruments of death more efficiently than its neighbors." In his final months, Lee often returned to his father's bitter wisdom. "The world doesn't want better, son. It wants familiar." The world had indeed wanted better weapons, and Lee had provided them. But the world had also applied those better weapons to familiar purposes: territorial disputes, resource competition, and nationalist ambitions that mechanical innovation could not resolve. The morning mist that had once clung to his Sparkbrook workshop like a shroud now seemed to envelop his entire legacy. Lee understood that he had achieved exactly what he had set out to accomplish. He had created weapons that ended wars quickly and decisively. The problem was that both sides in any conflict could now end wars quickly and decisively, creating symmetrical capabilities that prolonged rather than shortened conflicts. When James Paris Lee died in 1919, his obituaries praised the mechanical genius who had revolutionized military small arms. They mentioned production figures: over 3 million Lee-Enfield rifles manufactured during the war years, and tactical innovations that had given British forces significant advantages in colonial and European engagements. What they could not capture was the quiet anguish of a craftsman who had discovered that precision and dedication, applied to the tools of warfare, created instruments too efficient for the world's moral infrastructure. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that endured. It was the man who dared to imagine that an empire's fate could rest in the steady hands of a craftsman, who understood that true strength emerged not from violence, but from the precision and dedication of minds that refused to accept failure as final. Yet Lee's final revelation had been darker and more complex. Minds that refuse to accept failure can succeed too completely, creating tools that amplify human destructiveness far beyond their creator's intentions. The distinctive click of a Lee-Enfield bolt action would echo through future conflicts, operated by soldiers who never learned the name of the craftsman who had given them the capability to kill with unprecedented efficiency. The mist of that final morning carried the weight of unintended consequences, and the knowledge that some achievements can only be measured by what they destroy as well as what they preserve. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How do we measure the weight of weapons when they're carried by history itself?